Good evening. Welcome to this very special Center for Brooklyn History talk, Jewish Brooklyn from Gefilte fish to Kibbeh. Tonight is the first in a series of conversations that look at the history and lived experience of Jewish Brooklyn. We have a packed hour, and in a minute I will tell you a bit about what's in store. But first, let me say a word about the Center for Brooklyn History. I'm Marcia Eli, Director of Programs at the Center, which is a proud part of the Brooklyn Public Library. The Center stewards the most extensive collection of Brooklyn-related materials in the world. And one of our ongoing activities is to add to the collection in ways that represent and reflect the history and diversity of Brooklyn. That brings me to tonight. With the generous support of the David Berg Foundation, Center for Brooklyn History's expert archivists have spent nearly 2 years creating a collection, the Brooklyn Jewish History Collection, comprised of over 30 oral histories and more than 300 documents. A link to that collection, which continues to be added to every single day, is going into the chat. Our program tonight is also made possible by the generosity of the David Berg Foundation. So before we are joined by 4 amazing experts to talk Jewish Brooklyn eating, cooking, drinking, we're going to start by giving you a small taste of the collection. Sorry about that. With 2 short food-related excerpts from the many newly collected oral histories. It's my honor to introduce my colleague, Ariane Loeb, Outreach Archivist for the Brooklyn Jewish History Project, to introduce these excerpts and share a bit about her personal perspective about working with oral histories and how she has been immersed these many, many months. Welcome, Ariane.
Hi, good evening. I would like to say a few words on the collection. A year and a half ago, I started collecting documents and interviewing people for the Brooklyn Jewish History Project, funded by the David Berg Foundation. As much as I knew about Manhattan, its history and stories, I knew very little about or of Brooklyn and its Jewish history. I chose to start my project differently from what I usually do. As a Shoah specialist, when receiving a testimony, it is important to master a lot about the context, places, and so on, so you can help people who remember only bits and pieces of their story to put together the element of puzzle of their lives or their loved ones. I decided to approach the Brooklyn Jewish History Project differently and learn directly from the source and seize the opportunity to learn and discover Jewish Brooklyn, going with the flow of my interviews and collecting of documents, such as pictures, official documents, and memorabilia. Also, since the project was specifically about Jewish people, as a French traditionalist Jew, my perception of the American Judaism was rather the one of an observer, curious to understand a world so different from mine. So my question for these interviews were straightforward. Where is your family originally from? When did they arrive in Brooklyn? Or when did you move or live in Brooklyn? Are you involved in a specific community? And so on and so forth. And of course, I ask questions about food, because food holds such a large role in Jewish traditions, in Jewish everyday life, in Jewish holidays, Shabbat. And also, that much I know about Brooklyn. Who doesn't know about Junior's cheesecakes, Nathan hot dogs from Coney Island, etc. Now, I'm going to present you with 2 little clips with excerpts of interviews illustrated with some pictures. And you can find the whole interviews and pictures online in our Brooklyn Library digital collection in the Brooklyn Jewish History Project collection. The first one is an excerpt of Andrew's interview, who confided on his family story, which was a secular, non-practicing Jewish family, but its foodways totally identified them as Jewish, and Andrew shares his cherished memories of his grandmother and food. Here is the first clip.
Watched us would think of us as Jewish. We got together as a family on Friday nights at my grandmother's. I think that we had values which would generally be recognized as Jewish values. And certainly the foodways were very Jewish. My grandmother cooked in an extremely, traditional way. My grandmother was a master cook. I mean, part of her background, her family came from Svensson, which is a small city, I think northeast of Vilna, still Lithuania. And they had a bakery there. She grew up in a bakery. And then there's a lot of story about how they eventually came here, but she eventually arrived in Brooklyn. But she was, famous for being, I suppose, a number of things. She was an amazing card player. She was really the gin rummy queen of Brighton Beach. And then she was an amazing cook, and she, made everything iconic that you could imagine, but made it exceptionally well. So, the stuffed cabbage and the chicken soup and
gefilte fish.
She made her own gefilte fish, hand ground the fish, and all of that. She excelled at.
I also interviewed Annette Hillary. She has quite an amazing story. She went back to her Syrian roots through food and learning and collecting recipes to create a cookbook. And she passed that project on to her daughter, Jennifer Abadi, who is part of our panel tonight. Here's the second clip.
Your everyday life in Brooklyn.
Well, my everyday life was a lot of Jewish holidays, preparing for the holidays.
But you said that you never were taught how to cook. So.
No, we didn't cook, but we did.
Who was cooking?
My mother. My mother was doing all the cooking. All the women were doing the cooking. And so I never learned. And then when I got married, that's what started all this. My sister and I started this. We said, there are no recipes. I said, how do you learn how to do all this? We don't know how to do it. My husband at the time, he loved the Syrian food. He said, why don't you make a dinner with Syrian food? And I said, oh, nobody's going to want to eat that. That's just the food I grew up on. Who's going to want to eat that? He said, I want to eat it. He gained 15 pounds when he was courting me. My mother was serving him all the delicious things. He said, so I started calling my mother and said, Mom, Harold wants me to make all these things. So she'd come over and she'd help me cook. My sister and I would go to Brooklyn with my mother. We would drive to Brooklyn and we would bake with my grandmother, all the specialties. We were learning how to bake. And my grandma, it's very hard to get recipes from women who have done this all their life. She'd turn her back, she'd throw things into pots, she wouldn't tell us, and we were busy trying to write everything down. We were going crazy. But that's how the book started. It started with a loose leaf book of all, and I still have it up here, of all these recipes, jumbles of things. We'll try this one day, we'll cook this. My sister come over, and we would try things out, we would test recipes.
What did you try to achieve with this book?
We were trying to record the recipes so they wouldn't get lost.
Syrian recipes.
The Syrian recipes. We realized that my generation, and this is like the 60s and the 70s, it was going to get lost. It was one thing if you're growing up in Brooklyn and you could still go to your mother and cook there which they were doing, but we weren't in Brooklyn anymore. And unless we nailed this now, we weren't going to learn it, you know, and my grandmother and my mother were the sources, and my aunts also were very good cooks.
Thank you, Ariane. Now, as we turn to our really wonderful panel, I have two quick notes. First, as you'll hear when I introduce them, all of our panelists are extraordinary and beautiful writers. And we will put a link in the chat for you to buy some of their books, not all of their books, but some of their books at the community bookstore in Park Slope in support of our local Brooklyn businesses. And second, we want to welcome your questions for this great panel. Simply type them into the Q&A box. And now it is my true joy to introduce four amazing experts and tell you a bit about who they are. I'll start with Boris. Boris Fishman was born in Minsk, Belarus, and immigrated to the United States in 1988 at the age of 9. His book, Savage Feast, is a family memoir told through recipes. He's also written 2 novels, both of which were New York Times Notable Books of the Year, and numerous articles published in The New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, The Guardian, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and many other publications. He lives with his wife and daughter in Missoula, Montana, where he teaches in the Creative Writing MFA program at the University of Montana. Welcome, Boris.
Thank you, Marcia. I'm so happy to be with you today.
Jennifer is next. Jennifer Abadi, who you heard a little bit about, is an expert on Sephardic and Judeo-Arabic recipes and food customs from the Jewish communities of the Middle East, Mediterranean, Central Asia, and North Africa. She teaches cooking at the Institute of Culinary Education, the Jewish Community Center, Manhattan, and Context Travel. Her cookbook memoir, A Fistful of Lentils, Syrian Jewish Recipes from Grandma Fritzi's Kitchen, is a collection of recipes and stories from her family. Her second cookbook is Too Good to Pass Over, Sephardic and Judeo-Arabic Seder menus and memories from Africa, Asia, and Europe. A very timely book with Passover approaching. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Marcia. Thank you for having me.
So glad you're here. Jane Ziegelman is the author of the James Beard Award-winning book, A Square Meal, A Culinary History of the Great Depression, which she co-wrote with her husband, Andrew Coe. She's also author of the best-selling 97 Orchard, An Edible History of 5 Immigrant Families in 1 New York Tenement. Jane lives and eats in Brooklyn. Hi, Jane.
Hi, Marcia.
And
everyone.
Finally, our wonderful moderator tonight is Jeffrey Yaskowitz, co-owner of the Gefilteria and co-author of the Gefilte Manifesto cookbook. Jeffrey's writings have appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Forward, and many other publications. He chairs the food writing and cookbook judging panel for the National Jewish Book Awards, and he developed the Jewish Culinary Anthropology course at the City College of New York. In 2020, Jeffrey created and co-executive produced the Great Big Jewish Food Fest, which is fantastic. He currently serves as chef and scholar in residence for Taub Jewish Heritage Tours, for which he designed a culinary heritage tour in Eastern Europe. Hi, Jeffrey. Welcome, everybody. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marcia. Thank you to the Center for Brooklyn History. Welcome, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here talking about Brooklyn, Jewish food in Brooklyn with such a wonderful Brooklyn institution and such a great panel, all people I consider part of my extended Jewish food community. So thank you for being here. We're here to talk about Brooklyn. It's a diverse place. It's an international brand. It's an idea. It's also a major global Jewish capital with nearly a quarter of its population identified as Jewish. You can find 100-year-old Jewish food manufacturers here, You can find the offices, the headquarters of the leading kosher certification companies here in Brooklyn, and relevant for tonight, the largest Syrian Jewish community of the world outside of Israel, and one of the largest Soviet Jewish communities in the world here as well. I should say I live in Brooklyn, have lived here for many years. I live just steps from the Central Library in Grand Armory Plaza. Had this been a live event, I'd be really close to it. It would be so convenient. But I also grew up, I wasn't born in Brooklyn, but my father was, he grew up here. So I grew up hearing about a particular kind of Brooklyn, a Brooklyn of Sandy Koufax and Mrs. Stahl's knishes and Nathan's hot dogs on Coney Island, Junior's cheesecake, all of that. But we're here to talk a bit about some of the diversity that is also at the heart of this borough as well. So how better to ground this conversation than with food? So what we're going to do is actually all of our panelists have something to present, a little bit of a piece of their culture, and they're going to walk us through it and give us a little bit of a background of their own traditions, and that'll just get us jumping into this conversation. So Jennifer, we're going to start with you. You're a cookbook author, you're a chef, you have to have Passover on your mind now. What do you have for us, and how does it speak to your family's Brooklyn story?
Well, today I'm going to show you a haroset, a very traditional Sephardic and also Syrian style haroset that I prepared in advance. And the reason, not only have I chosen that haroset because it's leading up to Passover, it does have, even in its few ingredients, ingredients that you would often see in the Middle East and specifically also in Syria. And then we can use that after I show it. We can go from there. So I'm going to show you right now. What I have set up here first are the actual basic ingredients. I have the medjool dates, which are larger, softer dates that are really good for pureeing and making into haroset. I have just some basic chopped walnuts, a little bit of ground cinnamon, and then some Passover wine. You can also use grape juice. And what you basically do is you cook it all down without the walnuts. And then what you end up with here is a paste, which is perfect for representing the clay, right? That was supposed to symbolize the clay, or the whatever held together the buildings that the Israelites had been when they were living back in Egypt when they were slaves. So that's the haroset here. But what I also wanted to show you, because I think it's meaningful, talking about the old tradition versus the new. And this haroset was one that's in my cookbook, A Fistful of Lentils, but also in my Too Good to Pass Over cookbook, which focuses on many different communities, not just the Syrian, is this one here that I developed that's based on the flavors that are very common in the Syrian community. And actually, it's something that I always remember when I used to visit my great-grandmother, my steta, when I was growing up in the city, and we'd go to Brooklyn, and she had this candy that was basically a leather, an apricot leather or paste that was eaten like a candy. It was called kamardine or amardine, and it was basically apricots and lemon and sugar. And so what I did was I created a Syrian style haroset where you combine and cook down apricots, lemon juice, orange blossom water. These are all ingredients used very commonly, especially in syrups and sweets of Syria. And then we use pistachios, not only because we love pistachios and put them on everything, but the green flavor and color on the haroset works really well. So you have the two different harosets here, and you can serve them. What I love to do is I make, whenever I do Passover, because I have so many recipes from all over the world, I like to do a whole table spread, practically what I call a flight or a tasting of the haroset. So you can have the apricot style one or the traditional date one there. So that's what I have here.
Wow.
Today.
Jennifer, thank you for sharing that. We're going to get a bit more into some of your family story as well. So, but I'm so glad to see that. Now, I just want to quickly say, you do have, your father was Ashkenazi, so of Eastern European Jewish descent. Mm-hmm. Were there haroset battles in your home, or did the Sephardic haroset win out?
It won out in my family, the Syrian, but also because my father, I think he really loved, if you heard in the clip, my mother was saying that when my father met my mother and he tasted the Syrian food for the first time, he was blown away by it because his mother was coming from Riga in Latvia, and it was very, very different food. And my father really loved the Middle Eastern flavors and spices. So he actually encouraged my mother to prepare more of that stuff, as she put it, that she used to eat at home and thought nobody else would find it very interesting. And that's where eventually the cookbook was born, when she started to go out of her way to collect the recipes from her mother, my grandmother, Fritzi, and her grandmother, my great-grandmother, Esther.
Well, Jennifer, thank you. I'm excited. It's so different than the charoset that I grew up with: apples, walnuts, Manischewitz wine, some cinnamon. So I always love that the Sephardic style. Okay, we're gonna move on. Though we're gonna move to Jane. Jane, you have prepared something a little bit different for us. I'd love to know what you have and how does it connect to your own family story and some of your own area of research.
Well, first, because it's soup, I can't sort of tilt it toward the screen. So if you don't mind, the screen will be tilted toward it.
We will happily go with you, Jane.
Okay. Do you see what's in that bowl?
Yeah, it's sort of upside down. I can see, actually, maybe Jennifer or Boris, what do you see? You can jump in here. There's a big hunk of something in there. I can't tell what it is.
I think we should start by saying that we're all really impressed with Jennifer's camera work.
A lot of practice. A lot of practice.
Well, Boris and Jane, I don't know how many cooking workshops you have done, but I know Jennifer has been doing a number of Zoom cooking workshops.
Right,
Trial and error.
But I saw a beautiful soup. I happened to be quite hungry, so I was happy to see a very tasty looking soup. But what was that thing in the middle, Jane?
Well, that's the point. It was
Okay.
that thing in the middle. This is a recipe for my grandmother's vegetable barley soup. And it was made with bones, like every good soup is. And I've been thinking a lot about bones and the way bones are used in many cuisines. For instance, in French cuisine, bones are essential to making a consommé, bouillon, or one of those wonderful reduced sauces. But bones don't come to the table. If you're a Jewish grandmother, the bones come to the table. And my feeling is that that might be a metaphor, but I don't know what it's a metaphor for. So if anybody has ideas, I would love to know. But my grandmother did, in fact, cook with lots of bones, and I'm not afraid of them. And I like to gnaw on them. It's it's all very earthy. And these are some of the qualities that I associate with traditional Ashkenazi cooking.
I want to propose an answer because something very personal to me ties into exactly what you're saying, Jane.
Okay.
So I have this book, right? It's about Russian food, Russian Jewish food, I should say. And the cover designer at HarperCollins was scrolling through some photos that I had, and they wanted to sort of make the cover sort of a beautiful panoramic photo of a Russian Jewish table, right? And I thought, you know what would be more right? More right would be the photo of that table, not before the meal, but after the meal was done and after the table had been ravaged, right? And so this is actually a table at my grandfather's house in South Brooklyn, right? Where it's full of bones, right?
I love that idea. Let me just, following the bone theme, there were relatives in my family who knew how to chew bones until they formed like a mulch-like substance, and then they would spit them back onto the plate. And there was nothing unappetizing about this. They knew how much flavor was in a bone. That's where it's all, it comes from right there.
Well, I love this bone talk. I want to say this is quite amazing. Jane, you also had the fact that it was also a barley soup, I mean, that also speaks to some of the ingredients that were very common in the Ashkenazi pantry. So I just want to note that. And I know you were a little bit nervous. You said, I'm coming to this panel and I'm going to have a food that's not colorful. And you're almost playing into the stereotypes of Ashkenazi cooking, right, of Eastern European Jewish cooking being beige or brown and boring. And yet you still did it, but you came with such a, I mean, the bone in the center. I mean, I'd say a little bit of a fanfare here in this bowl of soup. So I want to appreciate that. And thank you for sharing.
No, exactly. No apologies.
Well, I appreciate it.
No
Thank you. Okay. Well, and so Boris, I know you have something to share with us. It's not a meal or a dish, but what do you have? And can you just, how does that place you here in our Brooklyn conversation?
So I think what I'm about to show you is not nominally, it isn't Jewish, but substantively, it couldn't be more Jewish for me. Basically, I spent now I live in Montana, but when I lived in New York, which I did for 20 years, I spent those years mostly on the Lower East Side, and not the hip part of the Lower East Side, the old school part of the Lower East Side. I lived on a street name where if you said it to somebody, nobody would recognize that it's in Manhattan, which is Lewis Street, right? Nobody's heard of that. So I was surrounded by old school Jewishness of a certain kind. And yet for me, that is not at all the environment and the forum in which my Jewishness expressed itself most readily. That happened when I went to visit my grandfather in Midwood, in South Brooklyn. He lived on the border of Midwood and Bensonhurst, where he continued to live a life largely like the one he lived in the Soviet Union, which is where we come from. And in many ways, it was like the life he'd lived in that country for decades, even before he came to America. But in his old age, he required assistance, and he was fortunate enough to have it from an incredible non-Jewish Ukrainian woman who their relationship is partly the subject of this book. And every time I went down there, sometimes we had quintessentially Jewish dishes, right? Like kasha varnishkas, right? Which she didn't realize was Jewish. Of course, she was made aware of it by the Jews of Ukraine, but it has been adopted so wholly by Ukrainians that she didn't even know where it came from. But sometimes there were very clearly non-Jewish Ukrainian dishes. And one of them was pickled fruit, which I had never had before. One day I simply asked Oksana how you make it. And so she taught me to make pickled watermelon. And for this event together, I decided to branch out and experiment and make pickled apples. So if I can emulate Jennifer and try to move this camera down so that you see these pickled apples. Here they are. And basically it's pretty straightforward. It's water, cup of vinegar, half a cup of either maple syrup or agave. And you just throw in all the spices you've got. And you let it sit for a while and put it in the fridge. This is just some star anise for prettiness. And they make an amazing combination for anything savory and sweet. They're great with chicken. I roasted some beets the other day and put them on top. It was a very happy combo. But the ideal combo for pickled apples, as you might know, if you know anything about my culture, is this. And so maybe I can belatedly kick off our event by, I don't know if anyone has anything with which they could toast me. By the way, also in honor of this event, I dug out some really pretty shot glasses that I thought we no longer had, but we do. So here's
I'm using
everyone.
a Moroccan tea glass. Can
Beautiful.
I use a Moroccan tea glass?
Beautiful, whatever you have. To all of you and to everyone in attendance, thanks for being with us. Beautiful. What do you have, Jane? What's that?
Well, I have tequila, which I really kind of like.
I got Ukrainian pickled apples. It's a big world. But after after we toast to everyone.
L'chaim.
Chaser. I just want to quickly say in closing that Oksana became a member of our family. She kept my grandfather alive for much longer than he would have lived had he been on his own. And one of the most beautiful moments for me is he was sitting at the dinner table one night, and she came over to serve him his dinner. And she had a cross around her neck. He obviously had a Star of David around his. And as she was leaning down to give him the dish, her cross hit his Star of David. And for me, that was such an emblematic moment because their lives melded. I mean, it wasn't a romantic relationship, but they came from the same country, the same heart country, the same stomach country, the same prostate country. And so the fact that there was this technical religious division between them was meaningless and incidental. And so the experience of cooking her food, which I have down there most often for me, is infused with the experience of the last years that I was able to spend with my grandfather in South Brooklyn.
Well, Boris, thank you for sharing, and thank you for hosting our evening. So I want to dig into a bit of context for some of these foods and traditions in these communities here. So Jane, can you just give us a sense of some of the immigration patterns? I want to go to the Lower East Side. You wrote the book 97 Orchard, of course, which talked about the immigrant communities and the intersections of those communities on the Lower East Side. What brought so many Jews to New York City? What were those patterns, and how did they eventually make their way to the outer boroughs?
Yeah, sure. The immigration of Eastern European Jews began in earnest in the 1880s, although people were beginning to trickle in the previous decade. And the reasons were really quite simple: economic hardship, virulent and widespread anti-Semitism, forced conscription in the Tsar's army. America was the answer. And as people know, many of those Jews settled on the Lower East Side, which became a kind of mythical homeland for American Judaism. In the 1880s, there's a kind of a real estate developer, business guy named Elias Kaplan, who decided to show Lower East Side Jews what they could have in Brownsville, Brooklyn. And that's a neighborhood I'm particularly interested in, and you'll find out why later in the program. But the idea is that Brooklyn is where you could still get fresh air. You could get fresh eggs. It was still rural. Fresh milk for the children. And he did, in fact, lure large number of Jews to this sort of what was then a remote Brooklyn neighborhood. However, the real exodus from the Lower East Side to Brooklyn began after the construction of the Manhattan and the Delancey Street bridges in the early 20th century, and then the extension of the subway lines.
Oh. One thing I actually really appreciate, Jen, is actually in your book, you talk about the tenements of the Lower East Side. There were Eastern European Jews who tried raising geese in the backyards of their tenements, and who there was the mushroom exchanges because of the, coming from more rural shtetls and coming into the urban landscape of New York City. You missed those elements of that culture. So I can imagine that appeal of a Brooklyn that was more fresh air, more outdoors. I could really see it. I mean, that same appeal eventually to the suburbs. Now, it wasn't just Eastern Europe. Oh, sorry.
The hardship for living on the Lower East Side, density. No one had lived in that kind of density. And in neighborhoods like Brownsville, there was a spreading out. But what happened eventually is that the tenements were reproduced. And what Jews had been looking for eventually evaded them.
Yeah. Well, and we're talking here mostly of Eastern European Jews. Jennifer, though, you told me and taught me about a very famous Syrian Jewish restaurant that was on the Lower East Side, and that there were Syrian Jews, of course, there as well. And I know your family went straight to Brooklyn. So I'm just curious if you can tell us a little bit about the Syrian Jews on the Lower East Side, but actually more so about how your family decided to make its way directly to Brooklyn.
Yes, so there were Syrian Jews as there were Sephardic Jews. There were Greeks, there were Turks, there were Balkan Jews, and immigrants who lived down on the Lower East Side. And so often people don't really realize, because there were so many more Eastern European immigrants overall living down there. But actually, the Syrians, when they lived down there, they even had like a school, their own school to go to. I read about, and I even spoke to someone who is related to the original owner of the Egyptian Rose, which was a restaurant that was down on the Lower East Side. It was called the Egyptian Rose, supposedly not because the woman and her husband, who were from Egypt, but because they thought it sounded more exotic. But she was Syrian. She was Syrian, and what she and her husband would do was prepare all the special dishes that were from the old country in Syria. And supposedly that's where a lot of mostly men who were Syrian and from probably just the Middle East, if they were from other places, they would go to eat meals and eat the food that they grew up with and they remembered, and also to play sheshbesh and just speak Arabic. And it was sort of like a way of trying to get away from and what was going on maybe outside. And then there they felt very welcome and very at home. And one funny kind of story was that basically she had two or three prices. There was one price for people who had a job. There was for a dish. There were people who didn't have a job, and then somebody who couldn't afford it all. It was for free. And the way that they would order is they would basically just go to the kitchen and just point to what they wanted, because it wasn't like there was a long menu. It was basically like I'm cooking in my home, in my kitchen, and you're getting what you're getting. So that was down the Lower East Side. And eventually the Syrian Jews, as did many of the immigrants, they moved out and did find their way to Brooklyn. And my family in particular didn't necessarily go to the Lower East Side and then moved to Brooklyn. By then they came already to Brooklyn. My great grandfather, Matlub Abadi, he actually originally, he was coming from Aleppo. My family was coming from Aleppo in Syria. He was a rabbi, and he wanted to come to the United States to be a businessman originally. That's really what he wanted to do. And he heard America, that was the place to go. Economically, things weren't great economically in Syria and parts of the former Ottoman Empire. And in 1914, during World War I, they were drafting people. They were drafting men, and Jewish men were being drafted to the army. And he and my great grandmother did not want him to go, and the economics were not good. So he said, "I'm going to America." So my great grandmother, his wife, went with my grandmother, who was born in Syria, and two of her siblings. She went to Jerusalem to be with her family, and then he came in 1921 right to Brooklyn, and he went there, and that's where he was persuaded by the community that was small but starting to grow to be the rabbi, to be the head rabbi there. So eventually he was persuaded. He was the rabbi at the Magen David synagogue, which is still there, small and functional, but very popular during certain events, funerals, and other things. And then he became the rabbi and a teacher there. And 2.5 years later, when he was settled, he sent for my great grandmother and my grandmother and her siblings, two of her siblings, from Israel, and they took a 30-day boat ride on their way to the U.S., to America, to port in Boston, and then make their way eventually to Ellis Island. And the story supposedly is that the laws changed while they were midway in sea, which would have turned them back to Syria. But when they got there, my great grandfather had the wherewithal and the means to hire a lawyer, went to Boston and stated his case to the judge, who eventually said, "Okay, you can come into America," but they had to go to Ellis Island anyway. So they went, my grandmother and my grandmother, when they went in a truck, some kind of truck or whatever, and my great grandfather followed them. And supposedly they stopped on the way to have ice cream, and that's when my grandmother had the soft serve ice cream for the first time, which she thought was the most amazing thing she ever tasted in her life, because it was so different from what she had in Syria, because the ice cream there was very different in texture and flavor, but she thought it was the best thing ever. And then they settled in Brooklyn, and they were in walking distance of this Magen David synagogue, and that's where they lived.
And Jennifer, very quickly, when we talk Syrian Jewish community in Brooklyn, there's a very, very specific area. What is that area?
So they're near Ocean Parkway and Kings Highway, Avenue S, T, that area. And over time, they created all their own community centers, synagogues along Ocean Parkway, and schools. So they have pretty much all their own things for their community till this day. That's almost all Syrian. And they all tried to live near there because sort of very old world, that they like their families, their extended families, to be very, very close by, walking distance, and also because they're very observant, walking distance of all the other places that they can go to, especially on Shabbat. So that's where they are.
Great, thank you for sharing that, Jennifer. And Boris, your family, similar to Jennifer's, went straight to Brooklyn, bypassed the whole Lower East Side experience. What was the appeal for Brooklyn? How was Brooklyn where you ended up going? Why? And tell us a bit about what you encountered when you got there.
It's funny, Jennifer, we're talking about the same streets. My grandfather was on Avenue P and West 10th. For us, there was no question of settling anywhere but New York, because that's how the sponsorship details worked out. New York sort of was the easiest place to settle if you were coming from the Soviet Union. You needed certain kinds of sponsorship, and sort of New York made it easiest to settle there. Obviously, no question of living in Manhattan. And it really wasn't an identity issue, it was an economics issue. Where could you afford it? And the only place we could was in South Brooklyn, in Bensonhurst specifically. And of course, we were preceded by, at this point, right, there were several waves. The immigration from the Soviet Union by Soviet Jews began in the 70s. And the first big wave came in 79. And it's so funny to hear how these stories overlap. It was me showing up in 79 that persuaded my parents to try to leave, because they didn't want me going into the Red Army when my time came, because that was not a very happy place, even if you weren't Jewish, right? And if you were, well then, you know, the imagination isn't enough. Other than that, I have to say that they were surviving in the Soviet Union, and may not have left were it not for my appearance. And of course, as soon as they resolved to go and declared their wish to go, that was right when the gates closed, because the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and the Americans boycotted the Moscow Olympics. And all of a sudden it became very complicated geopolitically for us to get out. And so it was like the worst of both worlds. We had already declared our intention to leave, right? Persona non grata, but couldn't get out. When we finally did by 1988, as I'm saying, we had been preceded by this wave of people who had managed to get out in 1979, and they were there. They were there in Brooklyn waiting for us with all kinds of incredible fluency that we could never imagine having in this strange new world. If you made up this detail in a work of fiction, it would be too heavy-handed to work, but we arrived in America on Thanksgiving Day. And we were sort of met at the airport by an acquaintance whom we'd last seen 8 years before. And when they were leaving, because they managed to go before the gates closed, we wrote all of our names and identifying details on very small pieces of paper. And then my grandmother, who was a master seamstress, she sewed that information into the band of this gentleman's underwear. And that is how our identities sort of got outside the Soviet Union. So at least somebody out there would know that we were people in need of assistance and rescue. And then 8 years pass, and then this gentleman, right, who was the same Soviet Jewish person we were in 1979, meets us at the airport and proceeds repeatedly upon meeting us to have conversations in fluent English with everybody, with the ticket agent, with the porter, with the person outside dealing with the taxis. It was really, he had been transformed into a completely different being by 8 years in America. And then when we got to their house, we saw something on the table we had never seen before. It was some kind of strange bird, a bird of a kind that we sort of had never encountered in the Soviet Union. Now, we were stuck in Italy along the way for a little bit longer than we were supposed to be because of some diplomatic complications. And we were starting to run out of funds. And the cheapest piece of protein at the supermarket were these enormous wings, twice, 3 times the size of chicken wings. We'd never seen them before. We didn't know what animal they connected to. We certainly couldn't understand the Italian on the little readout that explained it. But that's what we subsisted on for the last month of our emigration, our strandedness in Italy. And on November 23rd, 1988, we finally got to understand what bird these wings attached to. They were turkey wings all along. And I'll never forget, we said, why a turkey? And they said, well, it's Thanksgiving. And we said, but from whom to whom? And they said, we don't know, but you have to do it. And right, which is just, for me, the quintessential American story. In South Brooklyn, the Soviet Jews of South Brooklyn were left to be themselves, and somehow through what I still think of as an American miracle, that made them no less American than the Syrians next door, than the Pakistanis next door, than the Mexicans next door, right? That is the largesse of America at its best. You get to stay who you want to be, and yet you're fully integrated nonetheless. That makes you no less American. That was among the greatest gifts of all. And obviously the story goes on, but I'll cut it off there.
Yeah, well, Boris, actually, I'm just curious, and actually Jennifer as well. Both of you grew up in these. Well, Jennifer, you didn't grow up in that part of Brooklyn. That was where your family is from. You grew up actually on the Upper West Side, and Jane, you grew up there as well. But you had this Syrian community family in Brooklyn. Boris, you lived in this very I'd say Soviet specific community, right? What was did you experience, like, did you know from bagels and lox? What was your experience of what New York Jewish food is typically associated as? Like, I'm just curious, what did you even eat, Boris, in that part of Brooklyn? And Jennifer, I'm curious what you ate a little bit on the Upper West Side.
Jennifer, you go first.
Well, I actually want to tell us, when Boris was speaking about Thanksgiving, there's a story, because in my cookbook, A Fistful of Lentils, I have interviews and quotes from the Syrian community about all these stories that are related to the food and the traditions. And when he talked about Thanksgiving, I recalled a story that a woman told, which I think illustrates also how protective and how important the Syrian food that's really Syrian stays in the Syrian community and is continued. This woman told a story about how when they started in the Syrian community near King's Highway and other places, started developing little stores where they supplied like a little catering, where they started preparing special foods like laham bajin, which is a little meat pie pizza type thing, and sambusak and pastel and all these other delicacies that are Syrian. And the woman went in and she wanted to buy this laham bajin, which are these little meat pie things, for Thanksgiving as part of her holiday. And she told the guy who had the store, I'd like to buy this and he would refuse to sell it to her because he said, that is not a Jewish holiday. You cannot have laham bajin on Thanksgiving. So she was like, I guess next time, whenever she went in after that, she never told him it was for another holiday other than something that was very specifically Jewish. Because then later she went in and she told them, why don't you expand and make it more accessible and easier so we can really get these foods and that are prepared, that are Syrian. And he said, I don't want it so easy, because if I make it too easy and accessible, all the young women in the Syrian community, they're going to stop preparing all this food. So I don't want. So he hid everything in the back, even though it was there. It was kind of like this push-pull of wanting to share and wanting to have it easier and accessible, but not too much, because then you can kind of lose. It's like an awareness that we're here and we want to be here, but how careful do we have to still be about losing the tradition, whether it's in the food or when it's served or how it's eaten, and the culture and the tradition. So I think it shows sort of how the Syrians are.
And I'm just curious if you could just give us what are one or two quintessential foods of that Syrian community, or the ones that were important and that you felt were important to document. I just think that'll be helpful for us to understand a little bit more about the community and some of the foods you ate growing up.
Well, I would say that the special foods that are harder, they're sort of being lost, but you can get caterers to do, and especially you can even buy frozen now, that are really Syrian and loved, are those little pastries that you would serve in the Metze spread, which is like, or Maze we call it, which is the initial spread of food, which is a lot, all the different salads and spreads and pastries like pastel, which is a little pastry stuffed with spiced meat, or sambusak, which is the dairy one with the cheese inside, or the lachem bajin I spoke about before, were little dough, pizza size, small, with a spiced meat on top. Then there are the soups, like a kibbeh hamda, which is a stuffed meatball in a lemony broth with a whole squash, or meatballs and cherries. I definitely grew up with that. Or in the dairy, the squash cheese pie, or the Spanish jibin, which is the spinach cheese pie, rice and lentils. Those are things that first come to mind when I think of Syrian Jewish cooking, especially halabi, which is Aleppoan, from Aleppo.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for sharing. And so Boris, how about you?
So your first question was whether we had any identification with sort of the classically American Jewish foods. I mean, my grandmother, when she was still alive, she passed in 2004, so she was here for 16 years. She made the most incredible kind of gefilte fish. And I'm pretty certain that the reason she made gefilte fish, that was in a very particular way, and she didn't call it gefilte fish, she called it stuffed fish,
which is just a fair translation of gefilte fish.
Right.
Right. So I'm convinced that several generations ago, Jews from Eastern Europe came to America, right? And they brought those recipes with them. The ones who stayed passed them on until my grandmother got it. And I'm certain that sort of she was making the same gefilte fish as they were all that time ago. But that is an overlap rather than an active seeking out or attraction. For us, bagels and cream cheese and lox and zaybars, those were somebody else's traditions. Our traditions were inflected by Jewish life in the Soviet Union. And so even though technically gefilte fish was a part of them, so were blintzes, so were potato latkes, so were so many other things that were probably more Russian than they were Jewish. My grandmother made stuffed cabbage. We all know stuffed cabbage, right? But my grandmother stuffed cabbage, made stuffed cabbage in a braise, in the strangest braise you've ever heard of, which is torn up rye bread and sour cherry jam. Wow. That's what she braised her stuffed cabbage in, which was, I think, her way of approximating what we would achieve by combining, like, I don't know, tomato paste and brown sugar or something, right? But these are very specific things born of not only modest means, but the fact that there wasn't enough food to go around for everyone in the Soviet Union. So you used what you could get to get as close as you could to some of the same things that were made once upon a time. But then again, so many others had less to do with specifically Jewish upbringing than the Soviet experience, which was so homogenizing, left such a heavy imprint on us. And so, but that became integrated into our cooking.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And Jane, I was thinking of you as Boris was speaking, thinking about that encounter with this Americanized version of Jewish food from the Russian community, coming, or the Soviet community coming and seeing these foods and feeling bagels and lox and cream cheese, which is American. I'm curious if you could just speak to that little piece of this, the Americanization of some of these foods. And you grew up right near Zaybars and part of those other traditions.
Well, I would say that you cannot underestimate the importance of zaybars in perpetuating the appetizing tradition on the Upper West Side. And Barney Greengrass, I should pull in Barney Greengrass. I mean, that was our way of being Jewish on the weekends. But when we went to visit our relatives in the boroughs, and that meant Queens or the Bronx or Brooklyn, that's when the real Jewish stuff came out. So we understood that there were kind of levels, and we were playing around a little. We were and suspect because of it. But if you really wanted to get in touch with that Jewish core, you went to your grandmother's house.
Wow. Okay. And I think it's some of that grandmother cooking what you were describing, Jane, was probably more similar to some of those more Russian traditions that Boris was describing, and yet, but with some, of course, adaptation to local ingredients as well. And I was going to
Right. The funny thing is that the adaptations were just awful. She didn't know how to, she wanted to serve salad, this great sort of American refreshing course. And her salad was made with Wesson oil and like canned lemon juice. It was just, it wasn't good. But her roast breast of veal was exquisite.
Interesting.
Jeffrey, can I ask you a quick question? I actually don't know this history, but lox, that sort of, which is essentially synonymous with American Jewish life. I have a hard time imagining my ancestors in Eastern Europe curing salmon, or did they? Where does lox come from?
It definitely doesn't come from Eastern Europe. So yeah, that's the beauty. And just because for time, I can give you a whole long answer, but let's just say the beauty of this melting pot, or tossed salad, or whatever you want to call it, on the Lower East Side was you had immigrants from all around, and you had immigrants from Scandinavia and from Scotland and from these tradition places where they had access to, fish from, to salmon. I mean, most of the Jews in Eastern Europe had access to freshwater fish, carp, and they were getting herring by the barrel that was cured. And so that bagel, cream cheese bagel and lox, cream cheese itself being a New York invention, this became such an American tradition. And I'm sure Jane has a lot to say on this subject too. We're going to have to take Q&A in a couple of
really briefly.
Yes.
That it was. Yeah, like in a soundbite. It was a consequence of the transatlantic railway that brought salmon from the West Coast to fish refineries and fish pickling outfits on the East Coast. And that's really the story behind lox.
Yeah, understood.
And one of the, when I went to Scandinavia for the first time, and there was all this smoked salmon, there were no bagels, and I didn't know how to eat it. So it was confusing to me. Okay, so I just want to ask one quick question before we go to Q&A, and this is just a little bit, maybe more of a meta question, but I had promised Boris and Jane, we had talked about this idea of are people, is everyone from Brooklyn Jewish, or what is the relationship between Jewishness and Brooklynness? And it was just something that came up in our conversation before this this talk. I just wanted to just raise that there was some kind of connection there, and so I just want to raise that, and then we're going to take Q&A from the audience.
Jane, would you like to go first?
Well, if I could, do you mind, Boris, or
Please.
do you want to go ahead? Okay. I should say that there's a backstory to this question, and it involves a really wonderful book about being Jewish in Brooklyn called A Walker in the City by Alfred Kazin, one of the great Jewish intellectuals of the 20th century. And in A Walker of the City, Kazin makes this interesting connection between being a Jew and being from Brooklyn, in that both kinds of people are living on some kind of periphery, on some kind of outskirt. And being a kid growing up in Brownsville, he yearned to be part of the city. And the city meant one thing. The city was Manhattan. At the same time, he yearned to be part of the broader Gentile American culture. So it's this idea of the liminality of both Brooklynites and Jews looking to be part of some kind of centrifugal center that is, but I should add, let me add this one thing, Jeffrey, that he understood that being a kid from Brownsville meant that he had experienced a kind of magic. The magic of family, the magic of neighborhood, and the magic of community. but that wasn't enough for him. He still yearned for this place beyond. And he tells us that food was part of that place.
I just want to add one tiny thing, an immortal quote that's so germane from the great Bernard Malamud, which is, all men are Jews, some just don't know it yet.
That's great.
That's great.
I very much agree with this idea that Brooklyn is a Jewish place precisely because it is outside the center. In this way, even the Lower East Side that I lived on is Brooklyn and is Jewish in the same way. It's less about geography than a certain kind of spirit, a willingness to face up to certain realities about life, a connectedness to former histories and privations that I think plays into it. And I just think there's much more awareness of that in Brooklyn, whether you're Jewish or Pakistani, as I said, than there is elsewhere in the city.
Boris, you said to me once that the Upper West Side felt Goyish to you. Goyish meaning not Jewish, and it's interesting. It's a very Jewish area. In fact, Jennifer and Jane, you both grew up there, and big population. But what you meant was that there was. But actually, tell me what you meant.
Well, actually, small correction, you must have misheard. The first place I lived in New York before I went on to the Lower East Side was the Upper East Side.
Ah, okay. Well, that is surely a different experience.
Yeah. Right. And the Upper East Side for me was a deracinated experience, had nothing to do with being Jewish versus something else. There just wasn't a lot of full front, full-blooded, I eat the bones in some sense of the term, identity going on there. And I had to flee where I could smell the garlic wafting out of the restaurants, right? And where I settled on the Lower East Side, the garlic was wafting out of a Dominican restaurant, not a Jewish restaurant, right? But it delivered some of the same payload.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I thank you all three of you for sharing. There's so much more to discuss, and but we do have some questions, and I want us to get to those. And we're going to take about 10, 12 minutes for questions. And thank you all for writing questions and for asking. So first one is about gefilte fish. And so this was in the title of the talk. I also am a gefilte fish thinker and maker. And so Brenda asks, writes, speaking of bones, I distinctly remember my mother making gefilte fish by stuffing a whole carp with the ground fish. We ate every part down to the fish bones, including the roe and the yoch, the aspic or the gel. The head was reserved for my dad as an honor. Delicious. Any recollection about this tradition? So, any of you, any thoughts or ideas about this?
It's absolutely traditional. The head, I mean, it was a classic Rosh Hashanah dish, and the head, because it was the head of the year, would go to the head of the family. The bones were part of the boiling liquid because they added their gelatin and made that lovely golden jelly. And in addition to the bones, you would also add the onion skin as a kind of dye. And yes, it was very much a whole fish. That's the roots of gefilte fish, is a whole stuffed fish, a kind of Frankenstein creation, where you sort of disembowel, empty the fish, and then refill it. So it's absolutely a traditional presentation.
Yeah, I'll just add that one of my strongest memories of when my grandmother was still alive, though this was already far enough into our American tenure that sort of fissures had formed within our family, right? Because I was Americanizing at a much more rapid rate than my elders. But when we got together around my grandmother's table, and gefilte fish was often the thing on it, I have such a clear image right now of 4 adults all around the table sucking on various parts of that fish, right? The head was never reserved for some specific individual. It went around, I guess. But there was such peace and contentment on their faces that you otherwise never, ever saw there for any reason. But for those like 3.5 minutes that we took to eat, because we always ate very, very quickly, and there's sort of a lot of interesting things to say about why that is. But for those 3.5 minutes,
Talking about the gefilte fish, that dish in particular that brought out some kind of feeling of fulfillment.
Yeah, it took them back to the Soviet Union, where when things were simpler in a way, when their identity had not divided, when their identity had not been bifurcated. And it was so strange and gratifying for me as a 9-year-old or a 12-year-old to see these adults who were otherwise so worked up to go still and silent, for their eyes to close and their eyes like to roll back in their sockets, because they were just doing this thing. And if cooked right, there's no tweezering of the bones. Those bones had melted into the fish, right? So nothing to worry about.
Yeah, I'll just say, as someone who grew up in the suburbs, but who grew up with this Eastern European heritage, I grew up with gefilte fish, and we had the yoch, we had the gel, the aspic, but it also was something that sort of grossed me out. But when I went to the first Russian market, I saw just like a whole case full of various different meat jellies, aspic of different kinds. It was just I realized how disconnected my own family was from some of these European traditions. And so I imagine, Boris, you grew up with some of those as well.
Slurping aspic all the time.
There we go.
Indeed.
Okay, I want to quickly go. Gail asks, is there any food comparable to pizza in your Jewish food cultures traditions? So we have a few cultures represented here. Are there any pizza-like traditions? And I think of pizza, for me, and living in Brooklyn, pizza, it's the kind of street food. I can walk down the street eating this pizza. It's ubiquitous, but it's a kind of food that jumped the shark. It made it as well. So do you have any, however you want to interpret this question? Jennifer, maybe start with you.
Well, when you say pizza, instantly I thought of something that wasn't made with cheese, but the lachem bajin I mentioned before, which are these little, it's a piece of dough that's like round, and you have spiced meat on it. So it's meat and onions, and it's not with dairy. So that's something that is very common. But also the kibbeh nablasiya, they call it, or sometimes it's short. They say kibbeh, even though that can be a name for many different kinds of things, where you have a bulgur torpedo that's stuffed with spiced meat, and you deep fry it and you eat it right away with a squeezed lemon on top. And that you'll see in a lot of Arabic stores with prepared food. And that's like a kind of street food, but also a very special food that's made for certain occasions like weddings and other events.
I would just add that Soviet Jewish food is not to-go food. It's not walk and eat food. It's very much sit at the table for a very long time food. So the very sort of quickness and ubiquity of pizza does not have a neat match. But to the extent that there is one, it's piraski, which is dough stuffed with, let's say, ground beef, egg, caramelized onion, and dill. And they're very portable. They fit in your pocket. They'll keep you going for a long time. And this is something that, a perfect example of something that was more Soviet than Jewish, I would say, that was on every Jewish table I encountered in the Soviet Union.
Great.
I'd like to add one more possibility, is the knish, which is an eminently portable food and was sold on the streets. And it was particularly appreciated in cold weather, when you could hold it in your cold hands and get some warmth from it. So I don't think there's a close analog, but maybe all of these foods approximate something about pizza.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Those are all great. So someone asks, let me see what their name is, for recommendations, if you could all recommend a spot to try in Brooklyn, maybe a spot to go find Soviet cuisine or Syrian, or maybe it's a supermarket, or maybe it's a Russian bath that has really good borscht. A recommendation for those of us in Brooklyn who are looking to experience some Jewish food traditions. Maybe Boris, we'll start with you.
Sure, you actually named it. The Seagate baths, which are special also because they're in a corner of Brooklyn that few people end up going to. I think Seagate is actually a gated neighborhood, and these baths, these Russian Turkish baths, sit just outside of the gate. And whoever's in that kitchen knows exactly what they're doing. And they tend to focus just on all the staples, but they're there and they're executed perfectly.
Wonderful. And it's also known as Mermaid Spa, I think.
Correct. I refer to it as the Seagate. The official name is Mermaid Spa, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So if anyone's Googling, look for Mermaid Spa. Jane, how about you? A recommendation?
I don't have a specific business name, but I would say walk the streets of Midwood, look into the butcher shops, look into any of the shops, and you will find the ingredients that you've been looking for all your lives, but you couldn't find in your own white Anglo-Saxon Protestant neighborhood.
And that's where you go for bones, right?
Nothing against white.
Yeah.
That's my bone go-to. Yes.
Wow.
I've had an invader. My daughter's back from daycare, so she may be joining the conversation.
Well, welcome. Happy to have you here. And Jennifer, how about you?
So in Brooklyn, if you really want Syrian Jewish, I have to say you can walk along King's Highway where you have some of these kosher little grocers and markets, but they're not specifically all the Syrian food. Like you'll find some Syrian things with vegetables and fruits, spices, and maybe a few odd things here and there. So when I am in Brooklyn in that neighborhood, I will go in there to try to find a few things that are harder to find in the city in Manhattan. And then in the frozen section, that's where you'll find certain things that are like the pastries I was telling you about that you can heat up at home or finish the preparation at home. But the truth is that a lot of the real Syrian food is still something that you would almost have to be lucky enough to try and be invited to someone's home. And that's why I also spend time teaching these recipes so people can learn how to make them, but also prepare them for themselves, because most people don't know beyond the hummus and those kind of basic, the salads and those little and tabbouleh and those kind of things, which are from that region.
Mm-hmm.
Many people don't know beyond what's really Syrian unless they've been to someone's home. So.
Wow. There's a number of questions, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to. I've got one final question here for you, which is, what is the future of Jewish food in Brooklyn? Are there any developments, anything that you're seeing, anything that we should be looking out for Brooklyn Jewish food in the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Well, just for the Syrian, I would say that when I do go back and visit family, and it's usually for a special occasion, but maybe just to visit, they'll have more of the Syrian food when it's a big event. But then they're very much into experimentation, and they like vegetables and fruits and things that are healthy. So especially the younger generation. So you see them, it's kind of fusion a little bit, where they're trying to mix some of the Syrian Arabic flavors, but they're also very open to trying things that are Mediterranean and may seem to go well with the other things. So in the Syrian tradition, I see that, more.
Okay, amazing. I'm not sure, Boris or Jane, if you have any thoughts on this, and it's okay if you don't.
I just, because the only thing I would say is that that space where Russian and Jewish food meet is really waiting. I think it's on the cusp of a larger audience in America, right? We've had waves of different kind of ethnic cuisines, as I think they're somewhat problematically called, finding resonance with a wider American public. And I think that's just around the corner for the food that I come from. I think it's waiting for talented chefs to reinterpret it in a way, and it's happening already, but in a way that sort of rehabilitates it from the very incorrect idea that I think a lot of people have of this as heavier food or unhealthy food. It's nothing but. There's nothing unhealthy or uninteresting about pickled apples, particularly when you pair them with a roast chicken or roasted beets. So that kind of innovation, I think, is just ahead. And so I think that's where it's going to go in the near future for this kind of food.
That's good. Jane, anything you want to add here?
What I'm really interested in are the purveyors. And just to complete the circle, I'm interested in purveyors that will sell me organ meats and bones. And there are some. And I'm really happy. Jeffrey, you probably know the name of them. They're in Park Slope on
Fleischers.
That's what I need. I need a Fleischers. And if more Fleischers, if that kind of idea could multiply, I would be extremely happy. And I think a Jewish Renaissance, culinary Renaissance would be afoot.
So, and for those who are curious, Fleischers is on Fifth Avenue in Park Slope, and it's not necessarily, it's not a Jewish, specifically Jewish. They do sell pork there, a butcher shop, but it's a nose to tail butcher, and it's probably more like a lot of the old-fashioned butcher shops that did used to exist throughout Brooklyn and throughout New York City, where you could get all sorts of parts of animals that you wouldn't be able to get now, and it's just the reality of the demand and the market, and in some cases the laws, like lung, which is not legal anymore. Although I remember stories of my family eating lungen. And I'll just quickly say there is a lot of young innovation happening as well in Brooklyn. There are young Jewish delis, appetizing shops like Shelsky's, on Court Street. You have Russ and Daughters opened its a factory in, went from the Lower East Side, opened its factory now in Brooklyn, and you're seeing that as well. But you're also seeing a lot of not just purveyors, but products. So you have, Moroccan, North African harissas from New York Shuk being made here in Brooklyn. And, you also, of course, have these 100-year-old factories like Joiva that are sort of trying to reimagine themselves as well. So I just think that this is an exciting time for Jewish food in Brooklyn. And I like what you're saying, Boris. I think it's a time when this constellation of Jewish foods are going to hopefully come together a bit more, and maybe we'll see more of this Syrian, Soviet, Ashkenazi fusion in the near future. So I just want to thank you all three of you for joining us, for bringing some food and stories and your histories to share. And thank you, all of our wonderful participants for asking your questions, for joining us, for toasting with us, hopefully. And I want to thank the Center for Brooklyn History for hosting us, and the Community Bookstore for hosting our books as well. So thank you all. What a pleasure. And Marcia, I guess, I'm not sure if you want to close us out, but it really has been a joy to talk with everyone.
Same here, Jeffrey. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you. Okay, well, I